The agenda this week revisited the Confederation of Tomorrow conference from 50 years ago and scanned the year ahead in world affairs. The agenda's Week in Review begins debating the present-day challenges of divisive politics in Canada. I once asked a fellow pollster of Frank's, could the Trump phenomenon happen here? And his answer was no. And it couldn't happen here because we just don't have enough angry, white, bitter, quasi-racist men in this country to give, the kind of victory to a potential politician here the way it did for Donald Trump. Do you see that?
So I think it's less likely to happen here than in the United States, and there's all kinds of peculiarities to the American system that allowed it to happen there. That having been said, I think the association of anger and race is also a reasonable one given the U.S. pattern. But if you look at some of the data that we looked at, for this show, on issues about are there too many immigrants and too many non-white immigrants coming to the country, it just wasn't the case that you saw a very clear pattern of, as Stephen Harper called them, old stock Canadians saying, yes, there are too many, and newer Canadians saying, no, there are not too many. It was actually surprising at how much agreement there was, whether people were first-generation immigrants, second-generation immigrants, or, quote-unquote, old stock, to use Harper's term, Canadians. There was agreement on, almost agreement. It was a bit of a difference, but not too much. So I don't think the distinction on sort of race and gender lines, I think it's a reasonable one to make, but I wouldn't blow it up and make it too much of it. There is an opportunity to elicit, as Rob Ford showed, to elicit anger, frustration, anti-elitism, i.e. populism, among non-traditional groups in the population. So, nobody thought Donald Trump could happen in the United States either, and he did. I think a reasonable expectation, 15 years ago would have been that a Rob Ford would never emerge in Toronto, and he did. The NDP winning in Alberta, you see all of these unexpected phenomena happen, I think, because elites find creative ways to sort of appeal to things that were maybe unexpected or other people didn't see coming. So I wouldn't rule out the possibility of a Trump candidate in Canada.
I wouldn't rule it out either. You need to become president of the United States, you need like 48%, I think, of the popular vote he got. You can get elected here as prime minister with a majority government, 37% of the popular vote. So, yeah, absolutely could happen here.
It could happen here. You
Sure,
see, a Trump-style. I guess the point that your competitor was trying to make was that Canada is just a much kinder, gentler nation, more egalitarian, and the circumstances, the conditions for that kind of...
I'm sure our guy would have, his own brand of lunacy. Trump's very much an American character, but could somebody reach office in Canada who represented a minority, on either the left or the right, represented a Bernie Sanders worldview or a Donald Trump worldview? Yeah, absolutely.
Well, not Bernie Sanders. I'm thinking more on the other way, because
it could go either way. Is my point in Canada.
Frank, do we have by your polling, do we have enough angry, embittered, underemployed white men in this country who are ticked off about the way things are going and could give us a kind of a national government the way they've got in the States?
Well, again, think about the numbers. You've got people who are telling us my kids overwhelmingly are going to do more poorly. I didn't give you the most recent numbers, but the polling I'm just doing, I asked people, are you doing better than last year? 13%.
Are doing better than last year.
Are doing better. So this celebratory kind of Bay Street model that everything's wonderful. Look, both the American and Canadian economies, since this century has begun, are operating at about a 1.5% growth rate when you factor in the recessions. Mm-hmm. Of that tepid growth, much more of it being appropriated by a narrow cadre at the top. It oscillates from year to year, but overall those patterns are very clear. So you compare that to a period of the 50 years where the last century closed out, where growth was going 3.5%. Think about the compounding of 1.5 versus 3.5 and distributed in a far more egalitarian fashion, which saw this rise of shared prosperity. It's wreaking.
It's a very different society.
Look, we have, and I think maybe the issue is more class than race. And class, obviously, in the United States is highly interdependent with race. But in Canada, staid Canadians tell us if present trends with inequality at the top continue, we're going to see violent class conflict. Think about that. And I think this denial, the elite, and what was it, 10 days that shook the world, go back and read that for those are the there's other kind of cautionary notes for people who forget history. I'm not saying we're on the verge of bloody revolution, but I am saying that something is really different right now and that a lot of people are super unhappy.
Christine.
I think that because of part of the way how Canada was founded, whereby in the States they had to fight for their identity. So they created this narrative around them where whites were the home race, and then any other person or any other person of color who came in, they were the outsider. Whereas here in Canada, we're all immigrants who came in together. So instead, we've internalized multiculturalism as a value as opposed to identity being something that's our right that we have to fight for.
So you do not see greater polarization happening in the Canadian Commonwealth today?
No, I don't believe so.
Interesting. Okay. In spite of all the numbers he just showed.
In spite of all that, I think a lot of it has to do with the narrative, and the fact that Andrew Scheer is the one who ended up getting voted in to be the Conservative leader is a demonstration of that.
That's a good point, you know. Andrew Scheer is hardly what you call a radical ideological
No, but that was
right?
more a victory of the party rather than what the voters were thinking. He was trailing way behind Max Bernier, like by a margin of 2.5 times. So thank the dairy farmers and some of the institutional elites in the party. That was not a reflection of public opinion or voter preferences within. I'm not saying it wasn't a good choice. I'm just saying there was a disjuncture.
Can I ask about Justin Trudeau's victory from a couple of years ago? I mean, that was certainly the strong suggestion at that time was that the country was fed up with, or I guess a big enough chunk of the country was fed up with what Jason Kenney called the wrong tone from the previous Conservative government, and we were looking for sunnier ways. Do you still see that out there?
Yeah, I mean, I think people, would obviously prefer an optimistic candidate to a pessimistic one. But if they are angry, I mean, it's a very good point. Anger manifests itself in all kinds of bizarre, unpredictable ways. We might think personalities of the candidates matter. We might think things like their lifestyle or their sort of quote unquote, moral uprightness might matter. I mean, all of these things that we might think matter historically for the viability of a candidate can get thrown out of the window when anger is the motivating factor.
Let us do today what John Robarts suggested we do 50 years ago, and just start by taking the temperature of our country. Martha Hall Finley, how strong is our federation today?
Well, the federation is strong, but I think there's some real challenges with the people in it in terms of our attitudes.
Meaning what?
Meaning, I really feel there's so many examples of this now, and over the last few years that a lot of us are forgetting about being Canadian. A lot of us are actually forgetting that we are, in fact, a whole country. So right now we have provinces either suing or threatening to sue the federal government. We have the federal government challenged by municipalities. We have municipalities fighting against the federal government. We have Indigenous communities that are pro-development now having real challenges with Indigenous communities that are anti-development. And that's something that's also very, I think, new in terms of the current history. We have, for goodness sake, we have people in Alberta and Saskatchewan now fighting over whether contractors on construction sites have their respective license plates. There's very, very much a growing sense, I sense and I fear, that it is way more what is in whatever for me, for my region, for my municipality, for my community. And I really do worry that we're forgetting about what we need to do in Canada. I've been saying this the last number of while. We need a whole lot more Canadians. We need to put our Canada pants back on.
Put our Canada pants back on. I bet that's something that's very much evocative of Sir John's echo. What do you think, John?
I agree absolutely with everything that you've just said, and I think we need to look at what is happening in the United States. There are 2 times in American history where the United States was threatened with basically tearing itself to pieces, and the first was in the Civil War when it literally was being torn to pieces and 700,000 people died. And I think the second time in which they're threatening to tear themselves apart is right now. There's a reduction to tribalism in the United States that I believe that Trump is a symptom of. He wasn't the cause of it. And the greatest fear that I have for Canada, and is what you've just said, is that we follow that lead and we are reduced into tribalism ourselves. Whichever tribe that we choose to call ourselves Quebecers or Westerners or whatever we choose to say, that we belong to this group and we no longer see the national as the most important part of what we are as a people. I think we need to bring that back into our national conversation as a national conversation. There's a number of ways to do that, and I think this conference is a terrific contribution to that conversation.
Jen Wallner, what say you?
I have to say, I respectfully disagree. I think that part of being Canadian, which is a complete construct anyways, and not everybody feels Canadian, and that doesn't necessarily have a definition to it, but part of this country has in fact been people contesting one another and pushing each other to try and find their place and find their space, and through that contestation, that's how we've actually advanced. We also, unlike the United States, have stronger political institutions that help to prevent against kind of falling back into total tribalism or the same type of fragmentation and the discord that we're seeing there. It's not that I think that everything is rosy here in Canada either by any stretch of the imagination, but I, for one, am quite positive about the way that things can move forward.
Félix, 50 years ago, there were bombs blowing up in mailboxes in Quebec, which is one of the reasons why Premier Robarts wanted everybody, all the premiers, to get together and talk about what does Quebec want.
Yeah.
Are we clearer on that today?
Well, depends. What does Quebec want? Some people would just say more, but it depends also on what is more. But on this question, I would agree with Jen. I would like to state clearly that I think it's fully legitimate for citizens in Canada that to have to possess multiple and nested identities. And Canada being a multinational state, it is important to understand that there are multiple national constituent partners that need to come together and to discuss about what is the common good in Canada, and that there is no single partner in Canada, in a federation, that shall rule them all. And that, I think that is what's all about in federalism.
Leslie, I've purposely left you for the end because 50 years ago, Indigenous relations were not on the agenda of the Confederation of Tomorrow conference at all. Would you agree that today Indigenous issues are very much more front and center in the country?
Sure. I believe that is one of the positive changes that are occurring. I certainly, as the former chief of Chippewas of the Thames, felt it immediately in terms of our relationships, not only with the federal government, but the provincial government and the municipal government. But I would disagree. I think that what Canada has built itself on is the fact that it has differences in approaches, differences in perspectives. But what's missing is obviously the First Nation perspective, and it was missing 50 years ago. I wouldn't say it's there yet. I'm questioning what you mean by tribalism. I'm a little bit worried about what you describe as tribalism. I like to describe them as evolving political communities, and I think that something like the Confederation for Tomorrow is going to open up a really robust conversation that's going to let us just explain to each other our definition and terminology, and what we see will benefit Canada and the people inside of it, because I think there's got to be a recognition that First Nations don't often, and many don't, refer to them as citizens of Canada. And that's a real issue in terms of federalism.
The Trump administration clearly has a new way of doing business internationally. Do you see an overarching doctrine or strategy at play here so far?
An overarching doctrine or strategy. You know, Donald Trump is a surprise each and every morning that we get up and read our Twitter feed. You know, if confusion and chaos is a strategy, then he's certainly delivering in spades. At the same time, he does what he says he's going to do. He said he was going to withdraw from the Paris Accord. He did. He said he was going to scrap TPP. He did. So there's a certain level of consistency as well. I'm not sure it's making is strengthening the United States' position in the world. In fact, I did an economic briefing yesterday, and we were talking about the U.S. as a hermit kingdom. But he's certainly making international affairs a real spectator sport.
That is the truth. Besma, confusion and chaos were the two words that Laura just used. Now, there are those who think that he does that purposefully as a preordained strategy because it worked for him in business, and he doesn't know why it wouldn't work for him in international affairs. What do you think?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think he likes to keep people on their toes. Obviously, I think he also likes to appeal to his populist base that he's delivering, unlike all of those before him in Washington. He clearly has a chip on his shoulder about Obama and everything Obama did. So anything that he can do to sort of reverse Obama's actions is a win for him and his base because of how much they loathed Obama. But of course, I think there's also a broader strategy that he falls into, which is a sort of a unilateralist one in foreign policy, and that he does things not in the public good or in the larger moral good that perhaps previous presidents at least claimed to do, that he really does things, as he says, to make America great again. Now, obviously, there are many things that he supports that, frankly, any rational person would see as sort of counterintuitive and not helping the United States in the long term. But unfortunately, his base believes that these short-term types of interventions are in fact a win, and that's really the problem.
Tina, do you agree that there are counterintuitive things that are actually going to defeat America's national interest in the long run as the Trump administration goes along? And if so, what might be on your list?
I mean, it's absolutely true that we're looking at a very unpredictable president, but it's not just the president himself. I think we're looking at a larger sort of decline in the American influence on the world stage, not just because there are other growing powers who are exerting more influence, like Russia and China and India, but also the rise of non-state terror groups, as well as tectonic shifts we're seeing with the advancement of technology. Every day we're seeing new things coming out of the labs of artificial intelligence. Social media is changing how we do business and how governments and citizens interact with each other. And I think we have to be very careful to not attribute too much of change to President himself, and understand that we are living through a very different time in which there are so many revolutions happening every day as we speak.
Paul Stairs, who's the director of the Council on Foreign Relations Center for Preventative Action. And he said the U.S. is now the most unpredictable actor in the world today, and that has caused profound unease. You used to be able to pretty much put the U.S. to one side and hold it constant and look at the world and consider where the biggest sources of unpredictability, insecurity are. Now, you have to include the U.S. in that. No one has high confidence how we, Americans, would react in any given situation, given how people assess this president. What do you think of that assessment?
I agree with that. I mean, the one thing I would say, I do think it has been a policy of chaos and confusion, but there are ways in which he's been fairly consistent. He's been fairly consistent in terms of his antagonisms, especially towards North Korea and also Iran, and that is creating a climate of instability. And he's been very consistent with respect to his disengagement from traditional forms of diplomacy, multilateralism, for example. So what that's doing is that is creating a space for other actors to take on a more prominent role, and we're seeing that, and that's creating even further instability. So we're seeing moves on the part of China, especially towards Africa, and acquiring a great deal of agricultural land, resources, and other things. We know this is a regime that has not a lot of respect for human rights, and so they are propping up some governments around the world who are doing some unsavory things, and particularly in places like Eastern Congo, for example, and Sudan. We're seeing Russia and Russian interference in the war in Syria and elsewhere. So, you know, I think that while it has been unpredictable, and that is creating a great deal of confusion and reactivity and people sort of wondering where the U.S. sits, it also has been quite predictable in terms of his behavior and the way that he tends to assert himself, and other nations are beginning to react to that. Unfortunately, in the process of reacting to that, it is leading to greater instability and I think more uncertainty, particularly heading into 2018.
Well, let me follow up with Laura on that, because if in fact this America First approach and a certain retrenchment from international commitments and I mean, Samantha says getting out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership and other things as well, Paris Climate Accords, if that has opened a window to allow other potential superpowers to move in and fill that space, presumably that's not in America's national direct interest. And if that's the case, surely somebody has told the president that his policies may have the exact opposite outcome he wants them to have. Is anybody making that case to him that you know of?
There may be people making that case to him. People ask me all the time, Ed, isn't the president considering the long-term implications of this action and that action? And somewhere in the vast pantheon of the White House and the set of foreign policy advisors from the State Department and the National Security Council, I mean, there are still some very, very smart people working there in the United States, and it's their job and it's their mission to make sure that they are speaking truth to power and giving the best advice they can possibly give, and these are, you know, intelligent, rational, experienced people. But nobody in the United States, no politician has ever won or lost an election based on foreign policy. When it comes to where the voters go, it's all about domestic policy. So in terms of what Donald Trump is doing or not doing, the foreign policy dimension is the sideshow. It's delivering to that core base that elected him. That's his job one.
And that is the Agenda's Week in Review for this Friday, December 15th, 2017. You can see all of those conversations in their entirety at tvo.org. They're on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda. And thanks to our nightly Twitter live stream on our Periscope page. That's periscope.tv/theagenda.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.